The back entrance of Ashton Hall did not receive visitors, that was the point. Tradesmen used it. Delivery men. People whose presence the house acknowledged only in ledgers and receipts, never in conversation. Isabel Gray, who had spent the last 3 years learning, with some difficulty, to belong to that category, stood at the door for nearly an hour before anyone came to answer it. She did not knock again. She had learned that too, when the housekeeper's position had been advertised in the Exeter Gazette. She had read it 3 times before allowing herself to consider it. Ashton Hall. Devon. Immediate placement. A duke's household. 40 miles from the village where she and her sister had been quietly disappearing for the past 2 years. The salary was listed at £10 per annum. Which was 4 more than she currently earned. And 4 more than stood between Clara and the parish poorhouse. She told herself that was the only reason she had come. The door opened. A young footman looked her over with the particular expression of someone who had been told to expect an applicant and was disappointed by what had arrived. ISS stock, yes. The name came easily now. Bell stock. Bell, if they were informal. Neither. She was shown into a small room off the main corridor, not quite the servants' hall, not quite an office. A table. 2 chairs. A window that looked out onto the kitchen garden, dead this time of year. The beds turned over and waiting. She sat in a chair facing the door and folded her hands in her lap and waited. She was good at waiting. She had not always been. The door opened and she looked up. And the room went very quiet inside her chest. She knew his face not well. She had seen it once, 3 years ago. In a courtroom in London. She had been in the gallery. Women were not permitted on the floor, and she had gripped the railing with both hands and watched her father stand before the bench while men in wigs decided what he was worth. She had catalogued every face in that room. The judge. The prosecutor. The witnesses who stood and spoke in careful, measured sentences that added up, somehow, to traitor, and in the gallery across from her, in the first row, in a coat so dark it absorbed the light. A young man. Perhaps 19. Perhaps 20. He had not testified. He had not spoken at all. He had simply watched, with grey eyes that registered everything and revealed nothing. While her father was led away, she had filed him under irrelevant. There had been so many of them, bystanders. Observers, people who had been present for the mechanics of her family's destruction without participating directly. She could not afford to hate them all. She had limits. She had not known his name then. She knew it now. Alexander Ashton, 9th Duke of Ashton. Her employer. If this interview went well. Her means of keeping Clara out of the poorhouse for another year. He was taller than she remembered. He had grown into the coat, or something like it. Carelessness of his posture was different now. Less like a young man trying to look unaffected and more like a man who had genuinely stopped needing to perform it. He was looking at the paper in his hand, the one with her name on it. And he had not yet looked at her. Miss Stock. He sat across from her and set the paper down. Thank you for coming, thank you for seeing me. Your Grace. That he looked up. She had prepared for this. She had stood in front of the mirror in her room at the inn that morning and practiced the particular expression she needed, attentive, neutral. Slightly deferential without being servile. The expression of a woman who had been a housekeeper long enough that it no longer cost her anything to look like one. That his gaze moved across her face with the same quality she remembered from the courtroom registering. Cataloguing, and she held still and let it. You come from the Hargrove household, he said. 7 years, yes, Your Grace. Why are you leaving? Mrs. Hargrove passed away in September. The estate is to be sold. He nodded and looked back at the paper. She breathed. He asked her about staffing ratios. About the management of linen stores, about her experience with large-scale entertaining. About how she handled disputes between the kitchen and the upper household. She answered each question with the portion of the truth that was useful and no more. She had been doing this for 3 years. The lies were structural now, load-bearing. She did not experience them as lies. At the end. He set the paper down again and was quiet for a moment. "The position is immediate," he said. "The previous housekeeper left without notice in October, and the household has been a brief pause improvising. I should tell you that directly. Since it affects what you'd be walking into that I understand, and the salary suits you, I expect nothing beyond what was advertised, Your Grace." Something moved across his face. Not quite a frown. More like a word he had decided not to say. "Very well." He stood. "The position is yours. Miss Stock." She rose. She kept her eyes at the correct angle, which was slightly down and to the left of his shoulder. She turned toward the door. "Miss Stock," she stopped. "Welcome to Ashton Hall." There was a pause. Short, barely a breath. The kind of pause that, if you were not already holding your breath watching for it, you would not notice at all. Then nothing. Then the ordinary sounds of a room, a chair pushed back, papers gathered. Footsteps retreating toward the corridor. She filed it under irrelevant. She was very good at that. The household was worse than improvising. It was in the particular state of entropy that sets in when competent management has been absent long enough that the remaining staff have stopped expecting it to return. The kitchen maids had begun doing laundry on the wrong days. 3 of the guest rooms had not been aired since October. The account books, when Isabel finally located them, had not been reconciled since August. She did not comment on this. She simply began by the 3rd day. She had reassigned the laundry schedule, commissioned a survey of the linen stores, and identified which members of the staff were capable of working independently and which required explicit instruction for every task. The footmen were adequate. The kitchen was run by a cook named Mrs. Briggs who had been at Ashton Hall for 22 years and regarded any new housekeeper as a temporary inconvenience to be waited out. Isabel had met her type before. She brought Mrs. Briggs a specific request, a modification to the winter menu that required the cook's expertise to execute properly, and watched the older woman's expression shift, by increments. From hostility to cautious respect, she was good at making herself useful. She had learned that too. In the evenings, after the household was settled, she wrote to Clara. The letters were careful, cheerful things that told her sister about the house without mentioning the Duke. About the work without mentioning the exhaustion, about Devon without mentioning London. Clara was 14. She did not need to carry the weight of knowing how much was held up by £10 a year. "The country is very pretty here," Isabel wrote. "The kitchen gardens are large and I think they will be impressive in spring. I am well. Do not worry about me." She did not mention the moment on her second afternoon, when she had been reorganizing a storage cupboard and found a set of silver serving spoons, a particular pattern. A twist of ivy along the handle that were identical to the ones that had been in her father's dining room. She had stood there for a moment with her hand around one of them, the metal cold, the weight exactly right. And then she had put it back and closed the cupboard and gone to find the footman who was supposed to have polished the candlesticks. She did not mention that her room had, for no reason she could identify, a quantity of coal significantly in excess of what a housekeeper's room typically received. Or that the bookshelf contained 3 volumes that had been placed there recently. The spines were uncracked, the pages not yet softened with reading. She had assumed these were remnants of the previous housekeeper's tenure and thought no more about it. That was, she told herself, the correct approach. Notice only what was relevant. File everything else under irrelevant. She was managing very well. On Friday, she submitted the first week's accounts to the Duke's study. He was out, she had timed it carefully and left them on his desk in the correct format. Reconciled to the penny, with a brief note outlining the 3 most urgent maintenance issues she had identified. When she came to collect them the next morning, they were returned with a single line written in the margin, in handwriting that was precise and somewhat spare. "These are the first accounts I've received in this format since Mrs. Alderton left in 2011. Thank you." She read it twice. Then she filed it. She told herself it was irrelevant and went to deal with the laundry. The Duke's study needed reorganizing. This was not Isabel's opinion. It was Mrs. Briggs' delivered at breakfast on a Tuesday with the particular tone of someone who had been waiting for a housekeeper competent enough to handle the information. The previous housekeeper, apparently, had never been permitted past the study door. The Duke had managed his own filing. Which meant that 3 years of correspondence, estate documents, and miscellaneous papers had accumulated in a system legible only to him. He's in London until Thursday, Mrs. Briggs said. Refilling her own tea with the authority of a woman who had been at Ashton Hall long enough to do as she liked. If you were going to do it, now would be the time. Isabel had not asked for this assignment. She did not want it. A man's study was his interior life made physical. And she had no interest in Alexander Ashton's interior life. She wanted to know exactly as much about him as was necessary to manage his household. And no more. She went in on Wednesday morning with a box for misfiled documents and the intention of spending no more than 2 hours. The study was a large room, south-facing, with the particular quality of light that came from windows that had not been cleaned recently. Bookshelves covered 2 walls. The desk was a good one, old, well made. The leather surface worn smooth at the edges where hands had rested over many years. Her father had owned a desk like it. She did not think about that. She started with the correspondence, which was the most straightforward. Letters were sorted by date, bundled, and labeled. Estate accounts were separated from personal papers. She worked methodically, keeping her attention on the task and away from content she was reorganizing, not reading. She was 4 hours in when she reached the back of the lower left shelf. The account books here were older. Their spines faded, some of them predating the current Duke entirely. She lifted them out in stacks and set them on the floor to be sorted, and it was when she reached the 3rd stack that she found it. A document folded 3 times and tucked between the back cover of a ledger and the shelf itself. She unfolded it because that was what you did with misfiled papers. It was a map, hand-drawn, meticulous, covering a section of the Devon coastline that she recognized the tidal channels south of what had once been her father's land. The lines were precise and clean. Someone had spent a great deal of time on this. In the lower right corner, in handwriting she would have known anywhere, were 2 words and a date. R. Gray. 1809. She stood very still. Her father had been a surveyor before he was a viscount, before the title and the land had come to him through a cousin's death. He had never stopped surveying. He had maps like this one in his study at home, rolled and stacked along the walls. She had grown up with them. She had watched him draw this kind of line, measured, verified, true, with the particular satisfaction of a man who believed that the world could be accurately recorded if you were careful enough. She looked at the date. 1809, 6 years before the trial. 6 years before someone had decided that this man's careful, accurate records were evidence of something else. She looked at the room around her. At the shelves, the desk, the window. At the space where a man kept the things he chose to keep. She thought, why does he have this? She thought, why hasn't he destroyed it? She folded the map along its original creases and placed it back between the ledger and the shelf, exactly as she had found it. She spent another hour completing the reorganization. She returned the account books to their proper order, labeled the new filing system, and left the study. She did not think about it again until that night, when she lay in her room and watched the light from the fire move on the ceiling, and found that she could not account for where the last 3 hours had gone. She found a system. After that, she did not go to the study. She did not look at him for longer than professional courtesy required. She spoke to him in the specific register she had developed for this kind of interaction: clear, competent, impersonal, and she filed everything he said and did in the category of employer and left it there. It worked for 11 days. On the 12th day, she was in the library. This was legitimate. The library catalogue had not been updated in at least 4 years. And Isabel had taken it upon herself to begin a new one, which required going through the shelves section by section. She had developed the habit of doing this in the late mornings, when the household was occupied and the room was quiet. She did not expect him to be there. He was in the chair by the east window with a book open in his lap. And he looked up when she came in with the expression of a man who had been somewhere else entirely until that moment. She stopped in the doorway. I can come back, Your Grace. No. He looked back at the window, then at the book, as if reorienting himself. I was finished anyway. She went to the section she had been cataloguing, the history shelves, which were in some disorder, and began to work. He did not leave. She was aware of him the way she was aware of weather. A thing that existed in the same space and had to be accounted for without being engaged with. Several minutes passed. The previous catalog system, he said, without looking up from his book, was organized by the physical dimensions of the volumes rather than by subject. My grandfather's method. I never understood it. It does make it difficult to find anything, she agreed, in the specific tone she used for agreeing with employers. What system are you using? Subject first. Then author within subject, then date of publication. That he turned a page. Practical. She went back to work. Another few minutes. What is that one? He asked. She looked at the book in her hand, which she had just lifted from the shelf to be entered in the catalogue. A collection of lectures on political economy, published in 1808, with a commentary by someone she had read extensively before the kind of life in which one read extensively had ceased to be available to her, she said, with the specific tone of a housekeeper discussing inventory. A collection of lectures on political economy, Your Grace. 1808. A pause. You hesitated before answering that I was reading the spine. You were reading the spine, he repeated, in the tone of a man who was not arguing with her. Exactly. But had noted a discrepancy for the record. She put the book down on her cataloging pile. She picked up the next one. The commentary in the second half, she said, before she had decided to say anything at all, disagrees with the lectures it's supposedly supporting. The author argues for restricted trade in the introduction and then systematically undermines that position in every chapter after the third. It reads as though he changed his mind while writing it and didn't go back to fix the beginning. The room was quiet. She kept her eyes on the shelf. That's a fairly specific observation, he said. For someone reading a spine, I've seen the book before. She moved to the next section and did not look at him. In a previous household. It was not a lie. It was a fact with a substantial portion of its context removed, which was, she had found, almost always sufficient. She heard him set his own book down on the table beside his chair. The housekeeper before you, he said, had been with the household for 19 years. She was an excellent manager. When she left, she took with her the information that the boiler in the east wing had been repaired incorrectly in 1808 and would fail if the temperature dropped below a certain point, which it did in November. And I spent 3 weeks without hot water in half the house. She turned to look at him despite herself. That I am telling you, he said. Because I would prefer to have a housekeeper who knows things. Including things that are not strictly within the housekeeper's purview. He picked up his book again. The commentary in the second half is the better argument. He should have revised the introduction. She looked at him for a moment long. Than she intended to. He was reading, or appearing to read. She turned back to the shelves. Yes, she said. He should have. She worked for another 40 minutes. He stayed until she was nearly finished, turned one more page, and then left without announcing his departure. She listened to his footsteps cross the hall and move toward the study. Then she stood in the quiet library with her hand on the spine of a book she was not cataloging and tried to work out what had just happened. She could not put it in any of her categories. She tried employer again, and found it did not quite fit the way it had before. She put the book down and picked up her catalog and went on with the work. She was very good at that. The visitor arrived on a Thursday. Lady Alderton was 63, the widow of a baron, and had the particular quality of attention that comes from decades of watching drawing rooms for information. She had come to discuss a charitable arrangement with the Duke, something to do with the parish school, and she was to stay 2 nights. Isabel managed her arrival with the same efficiency she brought to everything. The correct room was prepared. Tea was sent up at the correct time. The footman assigned to Lady Alderton's service had been briefed on her requirements. The problem occurred at dinner. Isabel was overseeing the service from the doorway, not unusual for a first dinner with guests. When Lady Alderton looked up from her soup and looked directly at her, it was not the glance that guests sometimes directed at housekeepers. It was something else. A longer focus. The particular stillness of someone running a comparison. Isabel looked back at the COR. Rectangle present, neutral, invisible and did not let anything change in her face. Lady Alderton looked away. Isabel finished the evening service and went to bed and told herself it had meant nothing. The following afternoon, she was crossing the corridor outside the blue sitting room when Lady Alderton stepped out of it. A moment, Miss Stock. Isabel stopped. Of course, my lady. The older woman regarded her with that same measuring quality. Up close, it was more difficult to deflect. You have a very particular look about you, Lady Alderton said. I've been trying to place it since yesterday evening. I knew a family in London, the Grey family. The father was a viscount. Before she paused. With the delicacy of someone handling something unpleasant before the business in 1812. The eldest daughter was about your age. She had your coloring, your way of standing. The corridor was very quiet. I am afraid I don't know the family, Isabel said. Her voice was exactly right. I grew up in Somerset. You've most likely seen a resemblance. Most likely, Lady Alderton agreed, in a tone that agreed with nothing. She went back into the sitting room. Isabel walked to the end of the corridor, turned the corner, and stood against the wall with her hands flat against the plaster and her eyes closed. Somerset. She had said Somerset. She needed to remember that she had said Somerset. In case it came up again. She needed to make sure the footman assigned to Lady Alderton had no reason to discuss her history with the guest. She needed to. She needed to leave. The thought arrived cleanly, the way it had before. In that room in the inn when she had first seen the advertisement. She had ignored it then. She could not keep ignoring it indefinitely. Lady Alderton would not be the last person to look at her face and run a comparison. Eventually, someone would be more certain, or less careful, or less willing to accept Somerset as an answer. When she got to her room that night, she opened her trunk and began, quietly and methodically, to pack. She was not finished packing when morning came. This was not indecision. She had been precise about her reasons. Clara's school fees were due in March. She had sent 2 months' wages already, but it was not enough, and there was no other position she could move to without a reference, and she could not ask Alexander Ashton for a reference without explaining why she was leaving. Which she could not do. She needed 6 more weeks. She could survive 6 more weeks. She unpacked the trunk. She went down to breakfast. Lady Alderton was already in the dining room. The Duke came in at 8:30, as was his habit. She had learned his habits without meaning to. The way you learned the sound of a house settling in. Took his seat at the head of the table with the newspaper folded under his arm. He poured his own coffee. He did not look up. Lady Alderton waited until the footman had withdrawn. Or Grace, she said, in the pleasant tone of someone raising a concern over the marmalade, I wonder if you might tell me a little about your housekeeper. The newspaper did not move. What would you like to know? Where she comes from? Primarily. Her background. A small pause. I ask because I find myself uncertain about her. There is something in her manner that seems not quite consistent with her position. Miss Stock comes with an excellent reference, Alexander said. He turned a page. From a household in Somerset, yes. She mentioned Somerset. Lady Alderton set down her spoon. The thing is, Your Grace, I knew a family. The Grey family. Viscount Grey was found guilty of providing coastal survey maps to French agents in 1812. He was executed. The family was dissolved. One might say. Another pause. Your housekeeper has a very strong resemblance to the eldest daughter. The newspaper lowered by approximately 3 inches. Alexander looked at Lady Alderton over the top of it with the expression of a man who had heard something and was now deciding what to do with it. Isabel, standing in the doorway with the morning accounts in her hands, understood in the next second that she had made a mistake in coming down at all, that she should have stayed upstairs, that she should have kept packing. She is under my protection. Alexander said that. He said it the way he might have said the weather is cold or the roads are poor, as a simple statement of existing fact, requiring no elaboration and inviting no response. He raised the newspaper back to its original position. The dining room was very quiet. Lady Alderton looked at the newspaper. She looked at the footman standing by the sideboard. who was studying the middle distance with professional intensity. She picked up her spoon. "That I see," she said. "The kedgeree is excellent this morning," Alexander said. From behind the newspaper. "Mrs. Briggs has outdone herself." Lady Alderton accepted a serving of kedgeree. The footman refilled her tea. The morning proceeded. Isabel stood in the doorway for 3 more seconds before she remembered that she was holding the accounts and that she had come here for a reason, which was to place them on the side table for collection, which she did. With hands that she kept very still, she was halfway down the corridor when she heard his voice behind her. "Miss Stock." She stopped. She turned that he had come out of the dining room and was standing in the corridor with his coffee cup, which struck her as irregular. Did not usually carry things. That was what the footmen were for, and he looked at her with the same quality she had been trying to classify for 3 weeks. "The accounts," he said. "There's a figure on the second page I can't read." "The ink has run." She looked at him. "Which figure, Your Grace?" "The coal delivery in November." "I'd like to confirm the amount before I sign off on it." The coal delivery in November. She had written that figure herself, in her own handwriting, which did not run in ink. And he had already signed off on it 2 weeks ago. She had filed the signed copy herself. "Of course," she said. "You'll have a corrected copy on your desk by noon." He nodded. He went back into the dining room. She walked to the end of the corridor, turned the corner, and stood against the wall for the second time in 12 hours. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her sides and waited for them to stop. "She is under my protection." 4 words. Said the way you stated a fact about geography. Said in front of a witness. In front of a footman who would tell Mrs. Briggs, who would tell everyone in the household by luncheon. For words that had closed a door Lady Alderton had been opening, simply, completely. With the particular ease of a man who had the authority to close it. She could not fit this in employer, she could not fit this in irrelevant. She tried, and found the categories were the wrong size. And stood in the corridor with her hands at her sides and felt something shift in her chest that she had been keeping very carefully in place for 3 years. She did not know what to do with that. She went back upstairs and wrote out a corrected copy of the November coal accounts identical to the original, which had not needed correcting, and placed it on his desk at 11:45. She was 15 minutes early. She was not sure what that meant. She went to find Mrs. Briggs about the luncheon menu and did not think about it for the rest of the morning. She was very good at that. Or she had been. She was becoming less certain. She did not pack the trunk again. This was a decision she made at approximately 11 o'clock that night, sitting on the edge of her bed with her hands in her lap. And it was not the decision she had expected to make. She had spent the evening being very busy: the dinner service, the household accounts. A conversation with the laundry maid about the correct method for treating woodland busyness had always been reliable before. It had always been sufficient to keep the interior weather manageable. It was not sufficient tonight. She got up and sat at the small desk by the window and took out a sheet of paper. She had written resignation letters before. She had written 2 in the past 3 years. Both times when the position had become untenable for reasons she could not explain to an employer without explaining everything else. She knew the form. "I write to inform you that I must regretfully tender my resignation from my position as housekeeper, effective 4 weeks from the above date. Owing to..." She stopped. "Owing to..." She sat for a while with the pen in her hand. "The truth was, owing to the fact that I recognized you on the first day and have been waiting for you to recognize me in return, and today you did something I cannot categorize. And I find I am losing the ability to be here without it costing me something, and I cannot afford what it is beginning to cost." She could not write that. She wrote, "Owing to a family matter requiring my immediate attention." She looked at that for a moment. Then she added, below it, in smaller letters, as if she were writing something she did not intend to read back, "My name is Isabel Grey. My father was Robert Grey, Viscount Ashton." She stopped again. Viscount Ashton. The secondary title. Her father's minor title had been drawn from this land, this estate, this county. A coincidence she had been aware of when she applied and had chosen not to examine. She looked at what she had written. She picked up the paper and held it over the candle flame until it caught. Then set it in the grate and watched it go. She sat at the desk for another hour without writing anything. The problem was not that she wanted to leave. The problem was that she could not state clearly, even to herself, what she was leaving from. Lady Alderton was gone. That threat had been closed. Her position was, by any practical measure, more secure than it had been 24 hours ago. Clara's school fees were not due for 6 weeks. There was no material reason to go, there was only the fact that she was losing her categories. And she could not afford to lose them. And she did not know how to explain that to a man she was not supposed to know. She made herself a list instead. Practical things. The boiler in the east wing needed a second inspection before spring. The linen inventory was still incomplete. The household accounts for January would need to be submitted to the Duke's solicitor by the end of the month. She was needed here. That was a fact. It was not the same as wanting to stay, which was a thing she was not examining. She folded the list and put it under her pillow, which was not what lists were for, and went to sleep. In the morning, she got up and went downstairs and managed the household, and she was very good at it, and she did not think about the letter she had burned or the name she had almost written. She told herself, managing perfectly well. The Duchess of Ashton arrived without announcement on a Tuesday in late January. Isabel learned of this the way she learned most things at Ashton Hall from Mrs. Briggs, in the kitchen. In a tone that conveyed both information and the expectation that something would immediately be done about it. The Duchess' carriage had been seen on the lower road. The blue guest suite needed to be aired. There would need to be additional covers at dinner. She had the suite ready in 40 minutes. Yes, which was, under the circumstances, a small achievement. She did not meet the Duchess until the following afternoon. She was crossing the winter gardenia shortcut she had developed between the linen stores and the east wing when a voice behind her said, "Miss Stock." The Duchess of Ashton was a woman of perhaps 60. With the fine-boned quality that came from generations of careful breeding and the particular alertness of someone who had spent a long time observing things and drawing conclusions from them. She was wearing a dark green coat and no expression in particular, which was, Isabel had found, usually more dangerous than an expression, or grace. Isabel said, and waited. "Walk with me a moment." That it was not a request. Isabel fell into step beside her. They walked to the far end of the garden, where a stone bench sat under a bare wisteria. The Duchess did not sit. She looked out at the winter beds, the same turned-over beds Isabel had watched from the interview room on her first day, and was quiet long enough that Isabel understood she was being allowed to wait. "My son," the Duchess said finally, "has been a serious person since he was 17 years old." Isabel said nothing that he was not serious before that. He was, in fact, quite unremarkable, charming in the way that young men with good prospects are often charming, without much underneath it. Then something happened, and he became serious, and he has been serious in the same direction ever since. She paused. "I used to believe this was his greatest quality. I'm no longer certain that I am not sure I understand, Your Grace, that he believes," the Duchess said, "that certain debts must be repaid. That a man is responsible not only for his own actions but for the consequences of his family's actions, whether or not he had any hand in them." She turned slightly, not quite looking at Isabel, but orienting toward her. "He has spent a considerable number of years trying to repay a debt of this kind. I supported this. I believed it was right." The winter garden was very quiet. "The thing I have come to understand," the Duchess continued, "is that the manner of repayment matters as much as the repayment itself. A debt badly repaid in a way that the creditor cannot receive does not clear the account. It simply creates a different kind of obligation." She paused again. "And in some cases, it causes the creditor more harm than the original debt." Isabel looked at the bare wisteria and kept her breathing even. "Or Grace," she said carefully, "I think perhaps you are speaking to the wrong person." "That I don't think I am." The Duchess looked at her directly for the first time. "I think you are exactly the right person. I think that will become apparent to you soon." She turned back toward the house. "I also think that when it does, you should remember that my son has never, in all the years I have known him, asked for anything for himself. Not once. She paused at the garden entrance. That is either his finest quality or his most significant failing. I have not yet determined which. She went inside. Isabel stood in the winter garden for a while longer. The sky was the particular white of January in the Vaughn, not threatening snow, simply absent. The wisteria was a tangle of bare branches above the bench, promising nothing. She turned the Duchess' words over carefully. Looking for the shape of them. A debt repaid badly causes the creditor more harm than the original debt. She had understood this as a warning. A caution against attachment. Against the particular danger of gratitude sliding into something else. The Duchess had looked at her and seen a housekeeper who had been protected by a duke and was perhaps reading too much into it. She went back inside and wrote in her private journal. She believes I want something from him. She is warning me not to mistake his obligation for something personal. She is probably right to warn me. She closed the journal. She thought about the map in the bookshelf. She thought about the pause in the interview room on the first day. And the coal in her fireplace, and the books on the shelf, and 4 words said over a newspaper like they were simple facts about geography. She thought, what debt? She did not write that down. She found him in the corridor outside the library on a Wednesday evening. This was not accidental. She had been waiting for a moment when he was alone and between destinations, not in a room where she would have to leave it. Not at a meal where the footmen would hear everything. She had been waiting for 3 days, since the Duchess had left. Since she had spent 3 nights lying in the dark turning over the word debt and arriving nowhere useful. She had a speech prepared. It was precise and honest within careful limits, and she had rehearsed it enough times that she could deliver it without her voice changing. Your Grace. A moment. If you have one. That he stopped. He was carrying a book, which she had noticed he often did in the evenings, not reading it, exactly, more like carrying it the way some people carry a specific object when they need their hands occupied. Of course, I've been considering my position, she said. And I think it would be better for the household if I gave notice at the end of the month. That he looked at her. The household is in order, she continued. The systems are established. A replacement could step into the role without difficulty. And I can prepare thorough documentation to ease the transition. I think. She paused, which she had not planned to do. I think it would be better, he repeated. Yes. That he turned the book over in his hands, once. Better for whom? She had prepared for several responses. This was not one of them. For the household, she said. The household is functioning well. You said so yourself. For she stopped. She looked at a point slightly past his shoulder, which was what she did when she needed a moment. And then she looked back at him because she had decided, 3 days ago in the dark, that she was going to say at least part of the true thing. I cannot continue to pretend that I don't know who you are, she said. And you cannot continue to pretend that you don't know who I am. We are both pretending something in front of the other. And I find I am no longer able to do it with any. She chose the word carefully. Consistency. The corridor was very quiet. That he looked at her for a long moment. The book was still in his hands. Who do you think I am? He said. You are the man who was in the gallery at my father's trial, she said. You were 19. You wore a black coat. You watched everything and you said nothing and you left before the verdict was read, and I have never known what to do with that. She had not meant to say the last part. It was true. And she had not meant to say it. That he was quiet for long enough that she began to understand she had miscalculated. That she had given him something without receiving anything in return, which was exactly the kind of imbalance she had spent 3 years avoiding. You're right, he said finally. I was there. She waited. That I know who you are, he said. I knew on the first day. Your name is Isabel Grey, and your father was Robert Grey, and you have been managing my household under a false name for 11 weeks. He said it without accusation, without apology. Simply as the recitation of known facts. I know that. The words landed one at a time. Then why? She began. Because there is something I haven't finished, he said. Something that needs to be resolved before I can tell you what I need to tell you, and I am asking you. He stopped. And she realized she had never heard him stop in the middle of a sentence before. I am asking you to wait 1 more month. Perhaps less. He looked at her directly. I know that's not a satisfying answer. No, she said. It isn't that I know. She looked at him. He looked back at her without flinching. Which was either courage or the particular confidence of a man who had already decided something and was waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. What you said to Lady Alderton, she said. She is under my protection. What did you mean by that? Exactly what I said. That is not an answer. No, he agreed. It isn't. He shifted the book in his hands. Miss Stock. He paused on the name, the way he sometimes did. That fraction of a second that she had filed under irrelevant 11 weeks ago and had been failing to file there ever since Isabel. Will you wait one more month? She had not given him permission to use her name. She found she did not want to take it back. That I have nowhere else to go, she said. Which was true and was also not the reason, and she thought from the way his expression shifted slightly that he understood the difference. 1 month, he said. 1 month, she said. That he went into the library. She stood in the corridor and pressed her hand flat against the wall and thought. He knows. He has known since the first day. Every conversation, every account book, every corrected cold delivery that did not need correcting knew. She waited for this to make her angry. It was the correct response. She had been deceived, or at least managed. And she did not allow people to manage her. The anger did not come in the shape she expected. What came instead was something quieter and more dangerous, which she refused to name, and went downstairs to check on the kitchen, and did not think about for the rest of the evening. She told herself, still managing. The document arrived on a Friday in late February. Isabel was in the main hall when the post came. She was there most mornings, since the household correspondence passed through her before it reached the Duke's desk. The footman handed her the usual stack. 2 letters from London, an estate bill from the solicitor, a parcel of books from a bookseller in Exeter, and 1 envelope, thicker than the others. Addressed to His Grace the Duke of Ashton in a formal hand she did not recognize. She set the others aside and looked at it. There was nothing unusual about the envelope. The seal was legal in nature. She had seen enough of them in her father's house to recognize the type. A solicitor's office. Or a court. The kind of correspondence that arrived when something official had been concluded. She put it with the other letters for the Duke's desk and carried the stack upstairs. His study was empty. He had gone out early. She had heard the horse and was not expected back until afternoon. She set the correspondence on his desk in the correct order and turned to leave. The envelope was on top. She looked at it for what was probably 30 seconds. Which felt considerably longer. She had not opened another person's correspondence in 3 years. She had not opened her father's correspondence even at the end, when she had understood that something was wrong and had wanted desperately to know what. She had believed, with the particular stubbornness of someone who has very little left, that there were things you did not do. She left the study. She was at the end of the corridor when she heard, from the direction of the main stairs, the footman's voice. Young Thomas, who had been with the household for 2 months and had not yet learned to distinguish between letters that required immediate forwarding and letters that did not. Miss Stock, the solicitor's man is here. He says the letter was delivered to the wrong address. The one meant for His Grace was supposed to go to the other party first, and this one. Thomas held up a second envelope, identical to the first in every particular. This one is meant for you. She looked at the envelope. Her false name was written on it. Miss B. Stock, Co. Ashton Hall, Devon. Below it, in smaller letters, the name of a solicitor's office in London. That he said you'd know what it was about, Thomas said, with the helpful confidence of someone conveying a message he didn't understand. She took the envelope. She went to the linen room, which was the most reliably private space in the house, and closed the door, and opened it. The letter was 3 pages. Legal language, formal and dense, the kind of prose that said simple things in the longest possible way. She read it once quickly and then again slowly. Because the first time through she had not trusted what she was seeing. The matter of Robert Grey, Viscount Grey, convicted 1812 on charges of treason by provision of intelligence to foreign agents. Application for review of conviction, submitted 1812 by Alexander James Ashton, Duke of Ashton. Following review of original evidence and subsequent investigation, the conviction has been found to rest on falsified documentation. The charges are hereby. She stopped reading. she read that sentence again, application for review of conviction. Submitted 1812. Her father had been executed in September of 1812. 3 months later, someone had filed an application for review. She looked at the date on the application. December 1812. Alexander Ashton had been 20 years old. She stood in the linen room for a long time, then He went to the study and took her father's map from the shelf behind the ledger. Her hands knew exactly where it was, she had put it back precisely. She had not let herself take it, and she carried it to the Duke's desk and placed it beside the letter. She sat down in the chair across from his desk. The chair that was not for her. She sat in it anyway and looked at the two documents side by side, her father's handwriting on the map. And the name of the man who had filed a review 3 months after his execution. She had filed Alexander Ashton under irrelevant on the first day, she had filed him under employer when that stopped working, she had filed him under the man who knew and said nothing for 11 weeks, she did not have a category for this. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat on the desk, his desk, the worn leather surface. The edges smooth from years of use, and looked at her father's handwriting and waited for something to resolve. Nothing resolved. The clock on the mantelpiece said 11:30. He would be back by 2. She did not move from the chair. He came back at 1:30. She heard the horse in the yard, then the door, then his footsteps in the hall. She had learned the sound of them without meaning to, the particular rhythm, slightly uneven on the left where he had taken a fall 3 winters ago. Mrs. Briggs had mentioned it once. She had filed that under irrelevant too. She was still in his chair when he opened the study door. He stopped. She watched him see the desk, the map, the letter. The two documents placed side by side with the deliberateness of someone who had arranged them to be found. She watched him see her, sitting in the chair across from his desk, her hands folded in her lap. Waiting that he came in. He closed the door behind him. He looked at the desk for a moment longer, then at her. You read it, he said. That it was addressed to me. He nodded, once. As if this was a reasonable point and he was crediting it. He set his coat over the back of his chair and did not sit down. He stood on the other side of the desk and looked at the map and the letter, and she let him look. Your father drew that map in 1809. He said. A coastal survey of the tidal channels south of Gray's Reach. The survey was commissioned by the Navy Board, routine work. Nothing sensitive. My father had a copy made. He paused. He altered the copy. Changed several of the measurements. Added annotations that were not in the original. Another pause. The altered copy was presented at trial as evidence that your father had provided false navigational data to French agent. T.S. It was, according to the review, entirely fabricated. Isabel looked at the map, her father's handwriting. Precise and clean. The lines exactly right. Your father knew, she said. It was not a question, yes, that he knew when he was at the trial. He had arranged the trial. Alexander said. Your father's land bordered his on the south. There had been a dispute over water rights for 11 years. When the war made treason charges possible, he stopped. Yes. He knew. The clock on the mantelpiece marked the half hour. You were 19. She said. Yes, you were in the gallery. I didn't know then, he said. I knew my father had an interest in the outcome. I didn't know what he had done to secure it. He paused. And she heard in that pause the 19-year-old who had stood in a gallery in a black coat and watched with gray eyes that registered everything. I was told it was a legitimate case. I believed that. I should not have simply believed it. She said. You shouldn't have. He accepted this without flinching. When did you find out? November 1812. My father died in October. When I went through his papers, he stopped again. I found the original survey. And the altered copy. And the correspondence with the prosecutor. He looked at her directly. I filed the application for review in December. The original examiner had retired. Th. New appointment took 2 years to process the case. Then there were complications. Appeals. Counterfilings. The law moves slowly when the original verdict was politically convenient. 3 years. She said. 3 years, she looked at her hands on her knees. They had stopped shaking sometime in the last hour, she had not noticed when. And in 3 years, she said, it did not occur to you to find me. To tell me what you were doing. That it occurred to me constantly. He said. I didn't know where you were for the first year. When I found out. A slight pause. I didn't know how to come to you with a process instead of a result. I didn't want to give you something that might still fail. I thought. He stopped. You thought you'd wait until you had something to give me. She said, yes, and in the meantime you placed an advertisement in the Exeter Gazette. That I placed an advertisement in 4 county papers, he said. In October, when the review entered its final stage. I thought if you needed work. If you were in Devon. He did not finish the sentence. She looked at him. That is, she said carefully, either the most arrogant thing I have ever heard, or the most. She stopped, because she did not have the word for what it was, the other thing. The thing that had been sitting in her chest since she had read December 1812 on a piece of legal paper and understood that a 20-year-old had spent the first months of his grief filing documents on her behalf. I know. He said. I know it was presumptuous. I know you may have had no intention of. I know you might have been anywhere. I know it might not have worked. He was looking at the map. But it did. It did, she agreed. The room was quiet. You should have told me. She said. On the first day. When I walked in here with a false name and told you I would serve any master. You should have told me then. Yes, he said. I should have. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a moment. Because you sat across from me and said you expected nothing. And you meant it. You had arranged yourself so that nothing could reach you. And I thought if I told you then, before you had any reason to trust anything I said. It would have sounded like. He paused, like a man trying to purchase absolution. I didn't want absolution. I wanted. He stopped again. What did you want? He looked at her. I wanted you to have your father's name back. That's all it started as. And then you came here. And you managed my household better than anyone had in 20 years, and you told me that the author of a book on political economy had changed his mind halfway through and hadn't gone back to fix the beginning, and he stopped, and you what? And I wanted more than 3 years of letters to a solicitor, he said. Which I had no right to want. Which I am aware of. Isabel looked at the desk. At the map. At her father's handwriting. The lines precise and clean and true. She thought about a letter burned in a grate. About a name she had not let herself write. About 11 weeks of irrelevant that had never once actually been irrelevant. You called me Isabel. She said. In the corridor. 2 weeks ago, you didn't correct me. No, she said. I didn't. She stood up. She was standing on the wrong side of the desk, in the wrong chair, in the wrong position for a housekeeper. And she found she had stopped caring about the geometry of it. Tell me one more thing. Yes, the night Lady Alderton came to dinner. The cold delivery that didn't need correcting. The books on my shelf that were new when I arrived. She looked at him. How long had you been? From the first day. He said. From the moment you sat across from me and told me you expected nothing. She looked at him for a long moment. You should have told me sooner, she said, for the second time, because it was still true. I know, he said. For the second time. I'm sorry, don't apologize. Her voice came out differently than she had intended, not cold, not careful. Not the voice she had been using for 3 years to keep things at the right distance. Apologizing suggests the debt was between us. It wasn't. The debt was between your family and mine, and you've spent 3 years settling it through proper legal channels, which is. She stopped. Because her throat had done something unexpected, which is more than anyone else did. He was very still. I have a sister, she said. Her name is Clara. She's 14. She has been at a parish school in Barnstable for the past 2 months, and I have been paying her fees out of my wages. And I have been. Her voice stopped working correctly and she let it stop for a moment. I have been terrified, every week, that the money wouldn't be enough, that she would. Clara is at Thornfield House. He said quietly. In Exeter. She has been there since December. The fees are paid through the end of next year. Isabel stopped. It's a good school, he said. I checked the staff carefully. She is, from the last report, she is doing well. She has a particular talent for mathematics. Apparently, the room blurred. Isabel pressed her fingers against her eyes and held them there and breathed. Her father had been a surveyor. He had loved numbers. He had sat at his desk with his precise, clean lines and his careful measurements and believed that the world could be accurately recorded if you were careful enough. Clara was doing well. Clara had a talent for mathematics. You didn't tell me, she said. From behind her hands. That I didn't want you to feel. He stopped. I didn't want it to come from obligation. I wanted you to stay, or leave, or decide whatever you needed to decide. Without that in the balance, she lowered her hands. She looked at him across the desk, across the map. Across 3 years and 11 weeks and a false name and a cold delivery that had never needed correcting. That I am very angry with you. She said that I know that I have been filing you under irrelevant for 11 weeks and it has been the least successful filing system I have ever attempted. Something moved across his face that she had not seen there before. Not quite a smile. Something that might become one. That I've been attempting something. Similar, he said. How has that been working for you? Poorly, he said. From approximately the 3rd day, she looked at him. He looked back at her. The clock marked the hour. Your father's name will be cleared, he said. The announcement will be made within the month. Whatever you decide, whatever you want to do after that, I will make sure you have what you need to do it. That isn't contingent on anything that I know, she said. And she did know, which was the thing she had not been able to categorize. The quality that had broken every filing system she had tried. She had known, without being able to explain how, that none of it was contingent on anything. Not the coal. Not the books. Not 4 words said over a newspaper. None of it had ever been a transaction. That I don't know what I want yet, she said. I want you to understand that. I have been Belle Stock for 3 years and I am going to need some time to remember how to be Isabel Gray, and I don't know what she wants. That's fair, he said, but I don't want to leave, she said. That is the one thing I am certain of. I don't want to leave. And it is not because I have nowhere else to go. He was quiet for a moment. Then stay, he said. As long as you want. As whatever you want to be, she nodded. She looked at the map one more time. Her father's lines, precise and clean, and then she left it on the desk and walked to the door. Isabel, he said. She stopped. I am glad the advertisement worked. She stood with her hand on the door frame and looked at the corridor ahead of her, and felt something in her chest that she had been keeping very carefully in place for 3 years come loose, gently. Like a knot that had only ever been waiting for someone to find the right end of the thread. So am I, she said, and went out. The announcement appeared in the London Gazette on the 14th of March. Mrs. Briggs read it aloud at breakfast. Because Mrs. Briggs read everything aloud at breakfast. And the kitchen listened with the polite interest of people who did not know why their employer had been involved in a legal review of a treason conviction from 3 years ago and understood that it was not their place to ask. The footman refilled the teapot. The morning proceeded. Isabel was not at breakfast. She had been up since 5, as she often was, and she had read the announcement alone in the small sitting room off the kitchen, with a cup of tea that had gone cold. Robert James Gray, Viscount Gray, convicted September 1812 on charges of treason. Conviction hereby annulled and set aside, original evidence having been found to consist in material part of falsified documentation. The name and reputation of the late Viscount Gray are hereby restored to good standing. She read it 4 times. The language was what it was: legal, formal, impersonal, the prose of institutions performing a correction they would have preferred not to need to make. It did not say we are sorry. It did not say this should not have happened. It said annulled and set aside. Which was the legal equivalent of a man straightening a picture on a wall and walking away without acknowledging that he had knocked it crooked in the first place. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket and went to find Alexander. He was in the stable yard. Which surprised her. He did not usually manage the horses himself. He was standing with the head groom looking at one of the carriage horses, and he looked up when she came through the gate. she held up the folded paper that he said something to the groom, who nodded and led the horse back toward the stable. Then he crossed the yard to her. She did not say anything. He did not say anything. They stood in the stable yard in the thin March light, and she looked at the paper in her hands, and he waited. "That I want to go to Gray's Reach," she said finally. "I know it's been sold. I know there's nothing there. I want to go anyway. They'll have the carriage ready in an hour." She shook her head. Not the carriage. He understood immediately, which she had noticed he often did. "Give me 10 minutes, they rode out on horseback. Which was the correct way to travel in March in Devon when you needed the cold air and the open sky and the specific quality of attention that came from managing a horse. She had not ridden in 3 years. Her position had not included horses, but the knowledge came back, as the Bodis knowledge does. Without requiring her to think about it, Gray's Reach was 40 minutes south. What had been Gray's Reach was now a working farm, the house converted. The formal gardens turned over to kitchen produce. A man was plowing the near field. He looked up as they passed and touched his hat and looked away again. Which was exactly what you did when a duke and an unidentified woman rode through your field without explanation. She stopped at the rise above the house. The tidal channels were visible from here, the same channels her father had mapped in 1809. The lines she had grown up watching him draw. They looked the same as they always had. Water did not care about verdicts. She sat on her horse and looked at the house and the field and the channels, and Alexander sat a few feet away and did not speak. Which was the right thing to do, and she had known he would do it. She thought about her father at his desk. About the precise, clean lines. About a man who had believed the world could be accurately recorded if you were careful enough. And who had been destroyed by someone else's inaccurate record, she thought, annulled and set aside. She thought, restored to good standing. She thought, he would have hated the phrasing. Something loosened in her chest. Not grief. She had done the grief years ago, in pieces, in private. In rooms where no one could see. Something else. Something that had been held in place by the specific tension of wrongness, of a thing that had been recorded incorrectly and could not be corrected, and now the record had been amended, imperfectly, inadequately, in the language of institutions. But amended. She reached into her pocket and took out the announcement and read it one more time, then she folded it carefully and put it away. That he would have been pleased, she said. Not satisfied. He would have said the language was too passive. But pleased, yes. Alexander said. I think so. She turned her horse back toward Ashton Hall. He fell into step beside her, and they rode back through the March fields without speaking. Which was not the silence of people who had nothing to say, but the silence of people who had said enough for now and were comfortable with the rest. When they reached the stable yard, she dismounted and handed off her horse and went inside. And she went to the small room off the study where the household accounts were kept, and she took down the current ledger and opened it to the staff record. B. Stock. Housekeeper. Engaged November 1814. She found a pen. She drew a single line through the name, clean, precise. The kind of line her father would have approved of, and in the space beside it she wrote, in her own handwriting. Gray. She closed the ledger and put it back on the shelf. She was in the corridor outside the study when she heard his voice. Miss Stock. She turned. That he was in the doorway of the study, and he had the ledger open in his hands, and he was looking at the two names, the crossed out one. The new one with an expression she was still learning to read. There's a position, he said, that has been vacant for some time. It requires someone with an excellent memory, a high tolerance for impractical decisions, and a willingness to correct me when my filing system is wrong. He looked up. The salary is considerably more than £10 a year. She looked at him. That is an extremely poorly worded offer. She said. That I know. I've been working on it for 11 weeks and that's the best I have. She stood in the corridor with the March light coming through the window at the end of the hall, and she thought about a letter burned in a grate, and a map in a bookshelf, and 4 words said over a newspaper. And a school in Exeter where a 14-year-old girl was discovering she had a talent for mathematics. They'll think about it, she said. That he nodded. He looked back at the ledger, at the 2 names. Isabel, he said. Without looking up. Yes, welcome back. She stood in the corridor for a moment longer. Then she did something she had not done in 3 years, not genuinely, not without calculation. She let her face do what it wanted to do. Which was to arrange itself into something that was not managed or measured or filed under any category at all. She smiled. "Thank you," she said. "It's good to be back." She went down the corridor toward the kitchen, where Mrs. Briggs would be starting the luncheon. And the household would be doing what households did, and there was work to be done, which was a thing she had always been good at. The difference was that today she was good at it as herself.